Righto. So here we are in Photoshop. I think I mentioned in the intro was a 1987 graphic, but 88, so not far off. We can see we've got our registration marks set up here. I mean, in every layer within our 5-color graphic will have these 3 registration marks, and that just means that we do our best to line everything up using these as our guides. Now, I will switch over to a grey background just to make things a bit easier to see. And we'll just run through the separations and you might get a better understanding of how it's all put together. We're going to work our way from the bottom separation up, which means, you know, obviously start with white, and we'll work through our colours and then finish with our last screen, which will be black. So we'll start with the bottom layer, which is our white underbase. Many of you out there, you'll recognise this graphic straight away as soon as you see this first separation. So here we are. Now, I've gone ahead and named our screens and the mesh that we're using, but just for educational purposes, so we know where we're at. Now, if you remember right back in the first video, the first screen we stretched was the 120 mesh. Now, that mesh count, the 120 mesh, 120 meaning 120 threads per inch. That's really all that means. And you can go up, well, the highest I've got here is 300 mesh count, and that's super fine. It's not really something I use, so I don't use it at all these days. So 120 mesh count, that's as low as I'll go really for underbases, and that's going to let plenty of ink get a good deposit. Generally just one pass, and that's going to get all the ink we need down on a grey board, which is what we will be printing on. Not so critical, but if you're printing on a black substrate, there's a fancy word, screen printer's word, but substrate's just another word for the surface that you're printing on. But if we were printing on a black surface, for instance, that's when laying down a really good foundation of ink. Your base layer is pretty critical. For example, if you're trying to lay down a white base layer with a 300 mesh, which is like I say, super fine, you're going to run into all sorts of fucking problems. And I've done it. You end up going, you know, having to lay down 3 or 4 passes just to try and get a solid layer of ink down. It just becomes a head fuck. So why not do one pass, get as much ink through the screen as possible, lay down a good foundation, and you're off to a good start from the word go. Obviously, this is Mark Gonzalez, Man and Woman graphic, 1988, by the legendary Mark Gonzalez. This is his artwork. And I thought, obviously, we're not going over the tail with this one, so I'm not going to say it's simple, but it's a straightforward graphic, and we can do it on flat screens, hopefully without too many dramas. But let's move on. So the second screen here, also a 120 mesh, and this will be our blue layer. Now, I will say off the bat, these are just coloured for illustration purposes. When it comes time to burn these onto actual screens, everything's going to be black, and that'll make more sense once we start that process. So just understand that it's just coloured for demonstration, so you can see the graphic built up. So yeah, another 120 mesh, let plenty ink through. As you see, there's no real detail in this layer, and so we'll move on to number 3 here. Again, another fairly basic layer, all solid colour. Now, I did use the 160 mesh here. I probably could have used the 120, no problem, and I'm not actually sure why I did choose 160 in there, but that'll be fine. That'll let through enough ink for our purposes. Moving on to separation number 4. We'll start getting a little bit of detail in the form of our halftones. Now, for those of you not familiar with what a halftone is, well, it's basically just a series of dots that are used to give us gradients, shadows, to give us shading. It also helps add different colours to the palette. By laying one colour over another, you can get a third colour, you know what I'm saying, through the use of these halftones. So they're a handy device. Obviously, you're dealing with tiny little dots, well, that we need to increase the mesh count. So I opted for a 200, and I think 200 mesh is going to be fine for our purposes here. Now, one thing I will say is that these halftones that I've got set up here for the colour demonstration, these aren't what I'll be using. As we can look in there, they're a bit rough. I needed a transparent layer, so they were just converted in Illustrator. I have got the original halftone layer here, which I'll show you now. We zoom in on this, you see these nice clean dots here. There's actually a slight gradient to these as well. If you have a look here, you see that the weight of these dots will actually increase and decrease as we move down. That'll give you that subtle gradient look. It's actually present in the original graphic, so I've done my best to recreate that. Now, basically what we want to increase the mesh count when we start getting into fine detail work. Think of it as your resolution. So what it means is it's going to allow you to get a lot more detail before you start running into aliasing problems. And aliasing, you know, if you say you zoom in on a JPEG image, well, you're going to start to see jagged edges, and that's basically all that is. So when we increase the mesh count, it just means that the more threads you've got within that inch, the finer the detail you're going to be able to achieve. So that's exactly what we're doing here. With increasing to the 200 threads per inch mesh count for the halftone layer, we're going to be able to just get a little bit more detail and keep things nice and clean. Moving on to our 5th and final screen in the graphic here. Obviously we've got the black, and that's going to tie everything together and finish the whole graphic off. So I've opted for a 200 mesh here. And I think for this particular graphic that's going to be just fine. Not a heck of a lot of detail in this particular graphic. Only really when you get down into the copyright here. Apart from that bit of text down there, there's really not a heck of a lot going on in this graphic that would warrant anything higher than our 200 mesh count. That's going to give us quite a clean print. So I've got no concerns about using that one there. So really, that's the separations, and I think not a lot more to be said here. Hopefully you've got a better understanding now of how the separations work in their individual layers to build up an entire graphic. It's all pretty simple stuff really when you get your head around it. And from here we'll just look at actually printing each of these separate layers onto a transparency film, ready to burn onto our screens. So really just following on from our little graphics talk here, here's all our screens.